Thank you very much, but Richard, you're a hard act to follow. What I'm going to do is to talk a bit more about some of the problems and opportunities that face the radical and revolutionary left in Europe. It's very clear from what we've already heard that the defining issue in Europe today is austerity and the resistance to it. And the importance of Greece is it makes visible so starkly the combination, the most brutal austerity policies being imposed on people, but people fighting back on an immense and growing scale. And the challenge for any serious left in Europe is how they relate to building the resistance and helping to transform that resistance into something revolutionary in the way that Richard was talking about. Now, if we talk more concretely about the radical left in Europe, the truth is the picture is quite mixed. And it's mixed at two levels. The first is the level of politics, because you can see a kind of spectrum of organisations, starting with versions of left reformism that are particularly evident in Die Linke in Germany, which represents a very important break in what is still the strongest social democracy and workers' movement in the world. Moving left, you can carry on leftwards till you hit organisations like the organisations represented on the panel today, but also the new anti-capitalist party in France. In other words, parties that stand on explicitly revolutionary programs. So there's a degree of diversity in the nature of the radical left in Europe. There's also immense diversity in their situations, in that we can identify moments of advance. If we just talk about the electoral front, very important moments of advance. Richard has been talking about the successes of the United Left Alliance in Ireland, the advances of Antasia in Greece and so on, but there are also setbacks. Recently there was a general election in Portugal. The Left Bloc, which is one of the most important formations of the radical left in Europe, saw its parliamentary representation halved from 16 to 8. In lots of ways a very worrying phenomenon, since this was an election which is essentially on the question of austerity, but it was an election that was won by the parliamentary right, with the the equivalent of the Labour Party, the Socialist Party, being kicked out of government. So it's not simply that the politics is diverse; it's also that the situations are quite diverse. And I just want to emphasise two questions that I think are really, really important. The first is the relationship between the electoral struggle and the broader movements and struggles. And I think Richard got it absolutely right. The electoral terrain is important because it can give you a platform from which you can build the struggle more effectively. And just listening to Richard, you can imagine what difference it makes to building the movement of austerity to people like him in the Dáil, challenging the government and doing everything they can to help the development of struggles outside. Another comrade of ours, Petros Konstantinou, is on Athens City Council representing Antasia, and he, by all accounts, is creating absolute mayhem using that road. So, electoral successes are absolutely brilliant, but they're brilliant if they're seen as part of the process of building larger movements of struggle that are going to succeed outside the parliamentary arena, on the streets, and above all in the workplaces. And I emphasise this because I think sometimes there's a tendency to define what the parties of the radical left should be doing, essentially in electoral terms. To see the electoral front not simply as one front of struggle, and in lots of ways not the most important front of struggle, but rather to see it as the overarching purpose of the of the operation, to reduce what a party of the radical and revolutionary left does to what it does electorally. I think this is one thing that can get organisations into trouble. For example, the new anti-capitalist party in France is facing a very deep crisis at the minute, and that's essentially because it can't agree what to do about the French presidential elections next year. Now, the French presidential elections are important, and in a certain way they've got slightly more interesting as a result of developments in the last couple of days. But to imagine that the most important thing that revolutionaries in France should be doing is worrying about who they're going to support in the presidential elections next year, when the great juggernaut of austerity is smashing its way through French society as it is through other European societies, seems to me to get the priorities quite wrong. Apart from anything else, elections are an extremely difficult and unpredictable terrain to work on, as we here in Britain have learned to our considerable cost. The Portuguese comrades, let's get it right, in the general election before the last general election, the general election 2 years ago, got 8 seats. In the following general election, they went up to 16 seats because they succeeded in winning support away from the Socialist Party, the Portuguese equivalent of the Labour Party. Then, in the recent election, they lost the additional 8 seats they got, mainly because they think the Socialist Party voters they'd won previously went back to try unsuccessfully to keep the right wing from winning office. It's a tremendously fickle and unpredictable terrain. So it's really important to make electoral advances, and we should celebrate the successes that, for example, the United Left Alliance should have. But we shouldn't see the main thing that the parties of the radical and revolutionary left are doing as being winning seats, intervening in elections. The second really important thing is something that was mentioned particularly by Nikos. It's not simply that the parties of the radical and revolutionary left need to be building the movements, building the struggle. They need to be not simply celebrating the struggle, but trying to shape those struggles in a particular way. And one of the critical things at the present time is uniting the squares and the strikes. What we've seen in recent months, as both Jesus and Nikos described, is these fantastic movements driven by youth revolt that have filled the squares of the Spanish state and have also filled Synagma in Athens. That's absolutely fantastic. But unless that revolt is linked to the assertion of collective working class power expressed in the general strikes, then eventually those revolts will burn themselves out. We've seen that in Britain. The wonderful student movement of last autumn, absolutely magnificent, electrifying, inspiring, but something that actually burnt itself out quite quickly. I mean, we can feel its after effects. You could feel on the strike on Thursday and on the demonstrations in particular, the spirit of the student movement continued. But the important thing was precisely the fusion of the energy, the militancy, the anger that the students expressed with the collective power that only workers can exercise and are most visible when workers go on strike. And that kind of fusion of the squares and the strikes doesn't happen automatically. It isn't something that spontaneously is going to develop. It has to be worked for and organised and fought for by activists. We've learned, listening to Sameh Naguib speaking at this rostrum earlier today, that the miracle of Tahrir Square wasn't simply a miracle. It didn't just happen. That it was built by the hard work, the persistent effort of organised activists of the left and of other tendencies opposed to the Mubarak regime. And that the lesson of that experience applies to all of us. We have an immense responsibility to shape the movements and struggles that are developing. So our absolute priority has to be to those struggles, but we need to understand that movements happen without us. Movements aren't something that people on the far left simply can take out of their pockets when they think it's appropriate. They happen to a large extent independently of us, but we have the capacity, wherever we are, and however small and relatively disorganized we may be, not simply to be part of those movements, not simply even to build those movements, but to shape them in a way that can defeat, destroy the great juggernaut of austerity and begin to open up a perspective of revolution towards a different kind of world.